Welcome to another edition of Radio Influencers, a podcast series we're doing for Radio Update. I'm your host, Andy Meadows. On today's episode, we're going to talk about this week's massive cuts at iHeart and the reaction to it. But first, let's look at the results from our recent Radio Update polls. In last week's Weekly Wire poll, we asked a question that played off of Ava Hart's Coaching Tip 3 Things article, where she suggested for talent to be bold, take risk, and push the boundaries. We asked, are your on-air talent taking enough risks? A slight majority, 52% said no, and 48% said yes, a sign that many of the radio station decision makers who get our newsletter and respond to our poll think their talent should be taking more risk, which I agree with. In general, I think on-air talent tend to play it too safe. In Saturday's Weekend Wire poll, we asked a question to gauge the temperature of our readers about the thing everyone is talking about this week and our topic today. When we asked, what do you think about this week's layoffs at iHeart? So far, 48% said, bad move, you can't succeed without people, and 52% said, understandable, their debt left them with no choice. More on that in a bit. If you're not subscribed to our Radio Update weekly newsletters, you can do so by going to radioupdate.com and clicking the envelope on the right-hand side. We average a 40% open rate, so we must be doing something right. I have a consulting newsletter that comes out weekly as well. You can sign up for going to radiostationconsultant.com. Both are free. As always, this podcast is recorded using Riverside. I'll put my affiliate link in the show notes, or you can get to it by going to radiostationconsultant.com. If you use my affiliate link to sign up for a paid account on Riverside, I'll give you a free 30-minute remote session to give you some tips and tricks on how to use it. Now let's get into today's episode. If you have any questions or thoughts after watching or listening, email them to me at andy@radiostationconsultant.com or editor@radioupdate.com, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. It seems like every couple of weeks we hear about another big round of radio layoffs. So on the surface, this week's cuts at iHeart aren't much of a surprise. After all, they've publicly stated that they're planning on reducing costs by $50 million per year, in addition to the $100 million they've already cut. But the reaction to this round of layoffs seems different than the others. Maybe that's because it's less than 8 months since iHeart's last round of cuts, or because it's their biggest ones since the pandemic back in 2020, when everyone was cutting. Jerry Del Coliano called it a warning sign in his column this week. I tend to agree with almost everything Jerry says, although I'm a little bit more optimistic on digital than he is. But he has some really good insight on the debt iHeart and all the other big groups are trying to manage and how they're doing so. Garrett Seawright from Barrett Media talked about how some of the cuts in the smaller markets amounted to them losing either all or almost all of the remaining local on-air talent, saying, quote, that's not trimming the fat, that's gutting the operation entirely. That's true. I think the initial reaction most of us had to the news is, how do they even have room left to cut? In his newsletter this week, Jay Mitchell talked about the estimated 3,000 jobs iHeart has eliminated in the past 5 years, and he suggested to Bob Pittman, the CEO of iHeart, that he sell off all their stations below market 100, which sounds eerily similar to something I've written and talked about all large groups doing. Chuck Knight, a guy who's written articles for us here at Radio Update, pointed out how iHeart CEO Bob Pittman earns a total annual compensation of $12.79 million. I doubt any of that fat is going to get trimmed. My words, not Chuck's, but I bet he'd agree. I saw a fellow radio insider I know suggest on social media that advertisers should boycott iHeart, and Lance Venta with Radio Insight jumped in the comments to explain to him how that's probably not the best reaction because radio needs all the ad revenue it can get. I tend to agree with Lance on that. For those of us on the inside, these events cut deep, but I don't know how much they resonate with the general public, so calling for any kind of boycott on radio advertising is very likely to backfire on the broader industry at large than to just be targeted to iHeart, although I do understand the sentiment. I'm on record saying that I think the best thing for radio would be if the big groups who have no intention of operating and staffing their stations at the local level to sell them to a smaller independent group that actually does intend to run them. iHeart is certainly the biggest group and the one most guilty of leading the charge to thin out the industry. Crash Kelly asked the question, will the iHeart cuts be absorbed by the industry, in a blog post he wrote on sonicattention.com. A very well-written article, by the way, where he talks about how well our broadcasting skill set transfers to other industries, something I saw R.J. Curtis with CRS, who's been on this podcast, agree with. I'm in that camp as well. I don't think radio on-air talent fully understand how marketable and valuable their skill set is outside of radio now that everyone is trying to create their own content. Mainly that's because traditionally we felt like most of what we do in radio is specific to radio, which is no longer true. Crash's answer to the question about iHeart cuts being absorbed by the industry was an honest one, probably not in the traditional way, is what he said. Sadly, I agree with him on that. While some of the people who got fired this week at iHeart will land gigs at other radio groups, I suspect many, if not the majority of them, will find work outside the radio industry. Overall, the vast majority of the commentary I'm reading this week and seeing about the bloodbath at iHeart is overwhelmingly negative, which I completely understand. We are too tight-knit of an industry for these massive layoffs to not contain a name or two of someone we know and love. I'm also on record saying how ironic it was for iHeart to do a guaranteed human campaign as they were gutting the industry and, by the way, using AI for everything they can behind the scenes. Of course, if you regularly watch this podcast or read my articles, you know I'm an advocate for radio embracing AI tools, but not to replace employees, but to 10x the ones we have to make up for our already existing staff shortages. iHeart's fatal flaw, in my opinion, is that it didn't use the digital savvy they clearly have to train their staff at the local level to create better multi-platform content instead of trying to do it from the top down. Maybe I'm saying that as someone who doesn't run a company saddled with massive debt, but if consulting independent groups who turn a profit for 7 years now and working in radio since I was a small child has taught me anything, it's that radio wins when it values the personal connection between the station and the listener, and that only happens when there are talented and passionate radio people at those stations. My hope is that the rest of the industry doesn't follow iHeart's lead, or there will soon be no one left to cut. But what do you think? Comment wherever you see this, or email me at andy@radiostationconsultant.com or editor@radioupdate.com and let me know. As always, if you have some thoughts on this or any other hot radio topic, submit an article about it by emailing submissions@radioupdate.com. Thanks for listening, watching, and reading. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Radio Influencers.